Chapter 8, Formal Power. So, what is power? Potential to influence others. So, potential to influence, for when you look at the the capacity to produce effects on others, and with power and influence, it's clearly related in ways that distinguishes them between other people. Influence degree of actual change. So this is when you actually have the ability to influence what can happen, when it happened, and how things can happen because of your influence. Increasing motivation. You might change another person's motivation or encourage them to pursue promotions and do things that they wouldn't normally otherwise do because of your influence and your power. Cannot be ignored in negotiations. It cannot be ignored in negotiations because if someone has influence, you got to figure out how they're going to use it. Are they using it for the good or use it for the bad? But you at least have to know that this person, you're dealing with an influential person for that reason. Power is given by others, perceived and not inherited. So when you see power, sometimes it is perceived and not inherited. And I'll give you an example. Somebody can walk into a room and start talking, and all of a sudden you perceive them as having power. And subsequently, by you having that perception, you're giving them power. Power itself is not influential. So when we think in terms of power, it's not influential. It's just the potential to be influential. So there's other things that actually goes into it to determine if whether or not it's going to be influential. Potential versus actual power. Potential power, is be based on what one person's position of knowledge, or the source of the power. Actual power is based on the other parties acknowledging that source of power and their willingness to use it and exercise it. More power gives more tactics. So when you're thinking more power gives more tactics, the more options you have available to you, the more flexible you can be in your influence attempts, and the easier it is to adopt and tailor your tactics, to circumstances and the people that you're trying to influence. Types of power, legitimate power, role, status, resulting authority. So if we look at roles, status, and resulting authority, an individual's organization can be a role and a status, and that determines their legitimate power. So respecting and identifying which organization, respecting and identifying the organization. So respecting and identifying with the organization, this is more the members respect the organizational structure and identify with the organization, the more influential such a legitimate power can be. Knowing who, respecting and identifying, knowing who they are and what role they play in the organization. Can operate via several mechanisms. So, this might be influenced directly by respect for a position or status of a person, or some legitimate power, or some influence may, be the result of another party's influence about an implied power. French and Raven's taxonomy of power. So we look at this, we see type of power, and see level of formality. So we see legitimate power is formal. Coercive power, mostly formal, but can be informal. Resource power, mostly formal, can be informal. Expert power, mostly informal, but can be formal. Relationship power is informal. So when you look at these different types of power, and you see in your careers, before you're done working in your careers and before you retire, you're going to come in contact with all of these different types of power, and you're going to see them, and you're going to see how they're used effectively, how they're used ineffectively, how they're used for good, and how they're used for bad. Types of power: authority and conformity. So the appearance of power, one thing you have to understand, the appearance of power, the appearance of authority. So understanding that Some people, I used to always ask this question when I used to have to deal with organizations, external organizations in the federal government. I would always want to know who was in charge, but who was really running things. Because it's not always the person who's in charge. Somebody who appears to have the authority, sometimes they don't. And somebody else may have it. And that's why I used to always ask that question. Command of authority. So when you look at command of authority, this is individuals, who have this command of authority. So a lot of times it's in their presence. It'll be a legitimate authority through a position that they hold, or it can be not a position that they hold. Like I asked that question, well, who's really running things? So I want to know, I know who you tell me who's in charge, but I really want to know who's in charge. Who's got the command of authority? And a lot of times that is tied to a position which has legitimate authority. Individuals sought to resist authorities. So individuals, we look at this, individuals, this is where individuals, when you see who's in charge, you figure out who's in charge and who's got the authority, but you resist it. You resist it because you may not feel, that it's something that actually they're leading in the proper way, or they're using authority properly. So, and a lot of times, this is one of the reasons why you find when you have organizations, when you have like a major private industry, a major company, and a new CEO comes in, that's one of the reasons why he likes to bring in some of his own people, because he doesn't want resistance of authority from the previous people from the previous regime. Legitimate authority is more powerful. Legitimate authority is more powerful. This means that by virtue of the position that somebody holds, the authority that comes with it, versus someone who doesn't hold that position but has authority. Types of power, coercive power. So when we look at this, being able to inflict punishment. So coercive power, results, from being able to inflict punishment on another, like the playground bully, for example, is somebody that can be like that. Tied to fear and threat. So tied to fear and threat, you could influence because of fear, some degree of fear and punishment from someone else. In this way, a parent might take on his or her child to a fast food restaurant, or as a result of, to reward them or tell them they can't go as a form of threat. Neither right or wrong. This is not wrong or right. This is just what happens when we negotiate power every day in various relationships. And that actually just makes sense. So it's just some things, they are what they are. Types of power. Okay. Result of control over resources. So when we see a result of control of resource, this is ability to influence others as a result, of your control over, desired resource. It's called resource authority. Resources can take many forms, if you think in terms of tangible resources such as raises, promotions, and bonuses, to the less obvious things such as work assignment schedules, administrative support, technology, and through praise and recognition. Not necessarily hierarchical. So, while resources are usually available to those who, in hiring or education, this is not always the case. It is possible, for employees to control resources that have higher ups in an organization might value, an organization chart might not illustrate one's position, as being particularly high or powerful. In practice, such a position can entail, a large amount of potential influence. But that's that person I was talking about before, when I asked that question, not who's in charge, but who's running things to get to. Most basic feature of negotiation. Almost every negotiation is guided by giving and receiving resources. To the degree that the position of that the possession of these resources are influential. Describes how much power a party is holding. That resource has. So in a job negotiation, you think in fact that the company's controls the source of the job often will cause potential employees to perceive they have relatively little power. And that's a good example of it right there. Can be tangible and intangible. Can be tangible and intangible. Hey, it can be stuff that's tangible and intangible. Things that we can touch, feel, tangible, things that we think and we feel about emotion and stuff. So it can be either one. Originates from any source needed. So it originates, like for instance, if an office assistant is, in a sales organization controls scheduling of a business, travel, for example, that might give her, substantial power with respect to the sales representatives and organizations who want to arrange their schedule in certain ways. So she's controlling that resource for them, not them. Types of power: reciprocity versus resource power. Overt action to force others. So you got overt action to force others. While resources are clearly used to leverage reciprocity, resource power describes the overt action, to force others into a position by using resources, as a reward. Convincing between parties. Convincing between the parties, for instance, a manager who chooses, to offer a set of rewards to an employee will develop a much different relationship than a manager who works with the employee on a mutual agreement where they agree on rewards that are the best fit for and mutual needs. Relationship outcomes or reciprocity. So when we think about that, the relationship outcomes when using reciprocity is one of equality, and it's based on ideas of exchange between parties. So when we use the resources at the hand and we seek to understand, the side, we're trying to craft an agreement by which, not only is each side getting something that they want, but each side is working together to achieve, their goals. Using resource power, no equality. So, like a manager looking to be CC'd on all emails. He or she, is not interested in understanding an employee. Rather, he or she just needs compliance and is using the resources to achieve that end. So make no mistake about it. You send the email, but you make sure you CC me on those. So types of expert power, expert power. Expertise and knowledge. So we look expertise and knowledge. It's important resources. Like in modern information society, economies. They're characterized by increasing amounts of knowledge and work. So overlaps with resource power and legitimate power. So if you have overlaps with resources, resource and legitimate powers. So overlaps with resource power, this is when you have expertise or knowledge that the others need. That's defined. It's defined by a valuable resource. Overlaps with legitimate power. Expertise can come in the form of explicit certification, degrees, or form of professional affiliations that you may have. Leverages certainty. Leverages uncertainty. Expertise gives one knowledge that they can use to convince others. That's how you leverage uncertainty. Types of power: relationship power. Inherent and interpersonal relationships. So inherent interpersonal relationship. So relationship power. This is when it refers to the power inherent in the interpersonal relationship between the negotiators. So informal source of power. That's what. It's a relationship. It's like with a relationship power. This gives you like the power power to someone else because it gives power to someone else because that's the best way. You give power to someone else because, you want to maintain or improve your relationship with them. So you're giving them the power. Underlines trust and respect and liking. So this is when, you're like someone and you allow yourself to be influenced by them. When you trust someone, you're willing to believe that they're willing what they say and follow them because you trust them. Now that can be good and that can be bad. Power balance. So power does not guarantee success. Power does not guarantee success because if you have people who are misguided and they use the power, and I'm gonna be honest with you, the biggest thing I've seen a lot of times when it does not guarantee success, a lot of times because the person who has the power is actually incompetent in some capacity. And therefore, they don't use the power or make decisions that actually are beneficial. Issue may become distributed. So issue may become distributed. Even though you might sometimes be able to impose a solution, that you believe is beneficial for you, you may have inadvertently created a distributive agreement whereby one issue is distributed among the parties. So that's going to be different than when you're another way. Over-reliance on formal power. Over-reliance on, unfortunately, the over-reliance on formal power, it can cause you to miss an integrative agreement, whereby, multiple issues are combined in such a way that solution may not only benefit you, it benefits others as well. Perceived power balance. Perceived power balance, we often hear from people, teachers, often hear from people like students that say that, they're afraid to ask their supervisor a question, in their job, and you can't be. Bottom line is this: you got to be willing to ask anybody. So perceived power imbalance, because they have an imbalance. You see, it's too great. They have too much power, and you have too little. And you see, that's going to be an issue right there altogether, because ultimately that's not going to be good to get something that's desirable for you. Unfounded concerns about retaliation. So, unfounded concerns about retaliation, the mistake here is that in many cases, concerns about retaliation are completely unfounded. It's a lot of times it's what people believe. It's not what really happens. It's not what really goes on. Situation may involve power types. So, situation may involve power types. So, if a supervisor wants an employee to work overtime, there are a variety of options available in terms of how to influence them. The supervisor can tell them to work overtime, legitimate power, promise a future promotion for the employee, or indicate, working overtime might be less vulnerable to layoffs. See, now that one right there, that's definitely coercive power. Power exists in interaction. So power is not something that, is vested in you or your own. But it's something that exists only in the interaction with other people. Basically, you don't have power if they don't give it to you. They don't have power if you don't give it to them. So it's going to be through these interactions where you're going to be able to make those determinations. Relative and specific to relationships. Relative specific to relationships, you do not have a resource power in general, because you have a resource power in interaction with those specific individuals that value resources that you control. So if you have a resource and stuff, and this person over here has no need for your resources, you don't have a resource power over them. No power resources, no needed. So that's exactly what I just said. If you don't have a resource that's usable or needed by anybody, then there's no power in that. Why are we influenced? So when we look at why we influence, why do we give value to others? Type of power, legitimate power. So you desire to be obedient and conform to normative behavior. Coercive power, fear of punishment. Resource power, desire for rewards. Expert power, uncertainty about situation. Relationship power, value in a relationship. So in all of these particular situations right here, those, like I said, these are things that you will come in contact in the course of your career. And the one that I'll be honest with you, the one that you experience, get a lot of experience with initially and a lot of throughout your career, is going to be legitimate power. And that's by virtue of positions that somebody holds. Using resources as a leverage. So giving or removing resources. So you giving a resources, this is basically how you're going to negotiate. Giving somebody something that that they need or they want, or removing something that that somebody needs and want as a negotiation tactic. And that's going to depend on who you negotiate with, who you're negotiating with, and what works best. Give you an example. Some people are more motivated by reward. Some people are more motivated by fear. Rewards and punishments. So when you look at that, these resources, these negotiation tactics, they work depending upon who you're talking to and knowing what tactics they use. And then that way you can turn around and say, this is what works best. Again, an example I gave. Some people are motivated by reward. Some people are motivated by punishment. You got to figure out what. And when I say punishment, they motivate by the fear. They don't want to be punished. That motivates them. Using resource and coercive power. So using resource and coercive power, I guess the key, when using resource and coercive power is that it is aggressive. These types of power often they coincide and can be so determinant of negotiation outcomes. Like one party knows that they are more dependent on the other Thus, they are willing to make a concession. So that does happen. Dealing with formal and power tactics. So, dealing with formal power tactics. So if you're dealing with this, if you need, let's say if you need a particular resource and that person is trying to influence you and control you, then you have to have some considerable power. They'll have considerable power over you. You got to explore some alternative sources of resources or whatever else to try to figure out how to maybe reduce the level of power that they have over you. For instance, if somebody's got something that you need and they know it, and then you find somebody else who's got something that you may need, but it may not be quite as good, but now you got something to negotiate with. Using legitimacy. Negotiation tactic using formal power. So negotiating tactic formal. So, if a person on the other side of the table sees you as having that legitimate power, and that authority and values that legitimacy, then that tactic can be particularly effective for you. Authority is perceived and valued. Your authority is perceived and valued. That's subjective, how someone perceives it. If they perceive it, that you have it, and they value it, then that puts you in a position of strength for negotiations. Difficult to use with children. Well, it's hard to use these things with children, because children are not old enough to think like adults, so they don't understand. So it's kind of like trying to negotiate with a child about a car. And I know this is kind of a crazy example, but how could a child negotiate with you about a car when the child doesn't know so much? Building coalitions. So, building coalitions. Introduction or threat of other people. So you have an introduction or threat of other people. Another use for power. One traditional way for a person of low power to increase their power in a negotiation is to ally themselves with someone else, forming like a coalition. Function of strength in numbers. Bottom line is strength in numbers. If you've got 5 people who are taking a position, or 5 people willing to stand up for something, even if they're standing up to someone who has legitimate power and stuff, you have a better chance of getting someone to listen to you. See, now that reflects that this is not just my opinion, not just my finding, but these other 5 people also see it. Pooling the powers and resources. So when you're pooling the powers and resources, this is when you have a coalition is formed, and all the various types of individual power these members have on a coalition in terms of the resource, coercive, legitimate, they bring together. Parties must have shared interests. You got to have shared interests. Bottom line is this: if you don't have shared interests, it's going to be very difficult to build a coalition, because our goals are not the same, our interests are not the same. Identifying issues of aligned interests. One of the things you may want to do in negotiation tactics is try to identify prior to where you have alignment of interest, meaning with the other side. If there's some things that you have alignment on, there's a high probability those are going to be some things right there. It's going to be a keen interest to you and to them. You need to know that. Invoking background power. Another party with legitimate power. So another party. This is a common tactic in negotiation using background power. This takes advantage of a formal power. It's for one party to mention that they have by constrained by another party who does not have power. Background participant as power source. This is a background participant is somebody who's not at the negotiating table and stuff, but it's somebody that may have your back. And you may want to bring that person, name drop or whatever else, into the conversation during your negotiations, because both sides know that this person has legitimate power. Creates perception of coalition. Create a perception, a perception of coalition is a good negotiation tactic and stuff too, because if people see that there's negotiation go underway and we have a coalition or whatever else, again, it goes back to that situation, there's strength in numbers. Manage the impression of formal power. Perception of having formal power. There are people who have a perception. There's a perception of people having formal power. what you find if you're negotiation tactics and stuff, that'll help, because now the other side can see that they have a perception of this, that you have a perception of power, and they'll deal with you a certain way, or they'll view you a certain way, and it's usually from a position of a strength. Can involve material factors. So material factors, look, clothes, cars, watches, etc. With the attempted implication that if someone drives an expensive car and wears expensive clothes, they might be an important person, which implies that they are a powerful person. Obviously, when you use some of these, sometimes that's not the case. Subtle behaviors humans conditioned to. So you have subtle behaviors that humans are conditioned to. So when you negotiate, I'll give you an example. For instance, how do people, when they're trying to recall, which direction do their eyes go? When this guy gets nervous, what is he prone to do? When somebody's really thinking about something, how do they behave? Just subtle behaviors. And by being able to read those, it actually helps you kind of know what's going on in that person's mind, even though they're not talking to you. Power is a perceptual phenomenon. So again, the power is going to be a perceptual phenomenon because it's going to be perceived by people different ways. And it's amazing. There's sometimes you can have a situation where somebody doesn't have legitimate power, but they have a perception of it, and people believe it, that they have it, and so therefore they do have it, but it's informal. Benefits to leveraging formal sources of power. So easy for people to understand. This is low-hanging fruit negotiation. This is what most people expect in a negotiation, and so they are sensitive to it, and as opposed to, as they're sensitive to it, and not opposed, and using interest or indirect means which people may get or may be suspicious of. Perception of quick resolution. That is, it's okay. In some cases, in some situations, there may be a essence there that, there may be a window of opportunity that's closing, and that there may be a deadline that you can't miss. So you can use this, as a way to try to resolve something. Provides confidence to negotiate. So provides confidence to negotiate. Negotiations who have power, have been shown to, be more likely, to make strong opening offers in negotiations. Again, they're coming in trying to set the tone. Know how for maximum advantage. Know-how for maximum advantage. It would usually be a bad idea to start by using power to focus on your position, as opposed to interest or force situations. However, power typically works, although, sometimes with unintended consequences. So if it is a good to have as last result, or as a way to break log jams, or force people to come to the table and talk about things. Reduces ambiguity of the actual power. So bottom line is, we always want to look to reduce the ambiguity, because that means it's uncertainty, things we're not clear of, things we need to work out and hammer out. So use the power to actually reduce that, and can try to drive conversation to get things, to narrow things down. So based on positions rather than interests. So based on positions rather, by using formal power to convince the other party that in the negotiations to accept your position, or to accept a solution that that's closer to your position, then there's it's very likely that this discussion of interest was limited. Having formal power can be a trap that actually it prevents you from spending the time and effort to explore interest and alternatives. So that's it can work for you, it can work against you. Power dispersion, struggle to agreement. So in fact, you think of this is negotiators have power, also sensitive to retaining the power. So they may negotiate in such a way that so that as to protect their own power rather than to work in a collaborative solution with the other party. I'm trying to protect my position, save face. That's what I'm trying to do. Aggressive tactics in negotiation. Aggressive tactics in negotiation can be very effective depending upon who you're dealing with and what the situation is. It also can be very counterproductive if you're not careful. because it can come across as being too pushy and too forceful. Leaves money on the table. You know, because more optimal solutions that might benefit both sides are never explored or discovered. One of the parties might have enough power to dictate the terms of the agreement and the terms which on the other side accept or counter. This is either no interest or discussed, and no value is created. Harms relationship with future negotiations. Again, a bad experience in one can actually set you up for people to view future situations as being, something that's probably not going to go well because of what happened in the previous, involving multiple sources of power. Now, if you are attempting to influence someone, with resource power, but the influence target perceives your influence attempt to be entirely coercive, think about this, then it does not really matter what you intended. The negative consequences of coercive power attempt, is going to color the rest of your interaction. So it's just not going to be positive. Ethical considerations. Belief of other parties' rights. So you've got to believe that the other party has rights and that you want to respect those. And that's ethics right there at work. Bottom line is this: you want to be known as someone. Negotiation is inherently manipulative, viewing ability through various means. So when we look at these three things right here, you want people to negotiate. You want people to feel like when they negotiate with you that you are negotiating. You play hard, you strategize hard, you negotiate hard, but you do it with ethics and you play fair. And when you walk away from that, you want people to say, you know what? I respect you, you respect me. And there's no hard feelings because we actually just engaged in the game of negotiation. And it was just that. It was a process and went through. And you respected me, I respected you, and we did it in an ethical way. That concludes this chapter.